I am so grateful for this invitation. Thank you very much for coming to this last session and being willing to listen to a story about change in Texas. And I do bring you greetings from this fine state of Texas. I want to get started and tell a story about change. One of the things that Jose and I, when we visited on the phone, agreed on right away is that oftentimes change is informed by external pressure. And sometimes this can be a bad thing, and sometimes it can be maybe a little bit of a good thing. But at any rate, we all sometimes have to deal with external pressure. And I have to admit that this story that I'm going to tell starts with external pressure. There is something in Texas called the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Maybe you have such a board in your state. In our state, everybody just says CB, and everybody knows what that means. And they get to tell us sort of what to do based on what the legislature says that we should do. And we have to figure out how to make that work in the best way possible. And so it came to the attention of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board that we needed to take a look at our core curriculum. And when I say core curriculum in this presentation, I'm going to make it sort of like a synonym to general education, because there's, in many ways, that's sort of what we're talking about here. So when I say core curriculum, I also mean general education. And they said, you need to get a new one, you need to do it now, you need to fix it now, you need to revise it now, and you need to have it implemented by the fall of 2014, which is the semester that we just completed. Ready, go. How did that happen? Well, it happened because on the upside, the coordinating board makes a very good effort to try to be sure to include a lot of different faculty and a lot of advisory capacities. And the faculty are from lots of different kinds of institutions in the state of Texas. And that group spent a couple of years writing a report for the commissioner that basically pointed out the shortcomings of the current core curriculum general education that we had in the state of Texas. And in Texas, our core curriculum general education actually has special Texas code and special Texas rules and all of this. And so the chance to revise it was actually welcomed, because before that there had been about 50 learning objectives, all of which the state called upon us to assess and report to them. And it was very overwhelming, and nobody was actually doing it very well. And so the idea that we would want to revisit that made a lot of sense. And at the same time that those conversations were going on, there were many members on this advisory committee that were busy reading AAC&U publications. We were really glad about that. So when they finally sent their report to the commissioner, it was very much informed by a lot of the work of AAC&U, and at about that time the essential learning outcomes were emerging or had just emerged, and that document was very, very important in what this committee had to say to the commissioner. The funny thing, and I'll come back and revisit this a couple of times, is when that committee decided to revise or to call for a revision of the core curriculum in general education in the state of Texas, that was not what they were asked to do. What they were asked to do was to find a test, and everybody in the whole state of Texas was going to give the same test, and then we were all going to report our findings, our results every year. And the committee was supposed to evaluate all the tests on the market that might be able to be used for this and make their recommendation to the commissioner. That's actually what the commissioner asked for when we started. So weren't we happy when we were able to change that conversation? But you know, when I said things often start with external pressure, imagine that. Imagine if your job is to find a test to give every higher education student in the whole state of Texas, and you come out of it with things like value rubrics and essential learning outcomes, and you get to change the conversation. So sometimes external pressure can be good. A second committee of an advisory committee actually started to engage in the design of the new general education. And they focused again on the essential learning outcomes. And they focused, I should have put expected discipline areas here. It wasn't that the state said this discipline, this discipline, this discipline, this discipline, as much as they were talking about areas of the discipline. And this committee thought a lot about how to weave the outcomes throughout all of the courses that would be offered in the general education. And sometimes the assistant commissioner got a little bit pushy, and some of those he won and some of those he didn't. But at the end of the day, we ended up with basically a curriculum map of outcomes and disciplines that made sense for most of the institutions in the state of Texas that they could implement. And so it meant that outcomes, the essential learning outcomes, had to, by Texas rule, be infused throughout the general education curriculum. Luckily, it was always, all of those discussions were led by the faculty from many different kinds of institutions. And what would work? The faculty wanted to see communication and critical thinking in every one of the courses, and certainly that was the case. They were. So now there's a new report. The commissioner has now said, here we go. Now everybody start revising. You have 2 years. Let's go. Now began all the institutional work. So the provost and the presidents, they get an email that says, revise your core curriculum. You have 2 years. So you can imagine all of the faculty senates across the state, all of the curriculum committees across the state, and all of these wonderful universities and colleges having to bear down and get this work going. Again, external pressure played an important role, though, because one thing that was good was we were now infusing essential learning outcomes in all of the courses in the core curriculum. And institutions got to figure out how to do that. Within every institution structure, there was the expectation that it would be faculty-led, and we actually had to issue reports to the state that proved that we were using a faculty-led process. And so we began the process for planning, implementation, and assessment. And the assessment piece, I should add, was really focused on being very open in terms of options and ways for institutions to think about and talk about how they were going to assess the core outcomes. And the other piece that I just actually used the magic words, but I'm going to repeat them, it was the assessment of the core outcomes. So we weren't getting into assessment of courses and assessment of faculty and these things. We were talking just about the assessment of the outcomes, and that conversation remained very stable throughout. So in my university, the University of Texas at Arlington, we had faculty leaders, and we used existing structures of curriculum committees that are already in place. And I'm very sure your institutions have curriculum committees already in place. And the first thing everybody did was set about a timeline. This timeline, oftentimes people would think, well, what do we have existing? What do we have that we want to revise? And what do we have that we want to make new? And so a lot of times you would see universities and colleges thinking about how they would actually go through and take a new, fresh look at all the courses in their general education, sort of by category. And that seemed to work really well for a lot of institutions that I was aware of. And there were certain expectations for the syllabi at my institution. At my institution, the learning outcomes had to be clearly outlined in the syllabi. The syllabi would go before the committee and then, go up to the state, and we would always make sure that the outcomes were clearly stated. And the other thing that we did at our institution is we instituted a signature assignment piece. So when we would talk about the certain outcomes that faculty were going to have in their courses, we'd also think about what sort of assignments would students be able to do that would give them an opportunity to demonstrate the outcomes. Now, if you remember, this started because a committee in the state was supposed to find a test. So the fact that we're moving into this sort of course-embedded assessment and using students' best work to demonstrate, that was really actually an honor and a great opportunity to be able to talk about these things. And about that same time, we'd see publications. I remember Carol Geary Schneider using students' best work at about the same time that everybody was wrestling with these things. So it was a really nice way for us to share resources from AAC&U and other places like NILOA in order to get this going. And ultimately, it did result in every institution across the state submitting their new core curriculum general education and their assessment plan, and how faculty members were highly engaged in the process. And all of that sort of went to the state, where they had to, of course, hire a whole bunch of new people to read all of that, which sort of made me laugh. But anyway, they got it done, and everything got approved, and off we went. But the point is that since we were all in this together, everybody had to do things, everybody had similar questions. They had questions about teaching, they had questions about pedagogy, they had questions about assessment, they had questions about transfer, and every institution that was a public institution in the state, all these questions were emerging at about the same time. So it brought everyone together because we were all having to do this together. They were asking questions like, how do I teach teamwork in a large lecture class? They were asking, how do I assess critical thinking across so many disciplines? They were asking, how do I teach writing in a core math class, because communication was an expected outcome for all the mathematics courses. And so one of the things that we started to do, the group that really was a statewide faculty group, is they developed a listserv, and people were just, basically to get on the listserv, you either had to be Susan Albertine or a Texan, one of the two. Susan, I think, is on our listserv. I think Terry might be on our listserv. But all these questions started coming up because it was now urgent. We had to figure out how to do this. And people wanted to do it well, so they started asking a lot of questions. And one of the things that I learned about change in all of this is that resources are really important and they need to be readily available. And we're lucky that AAC&U gives us so many resources. We're lucky that NILOA, the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, gives us so many resources. And so those things were just flying around between institutions, and institutions were talking to each other a lot because we all had to figure this out together. Best practices emerged, best practice conversations emerged, or maybe how would we start to do a best practice if we become aware of it. The registrars had to talk about transfer, so all the registrars in the state of Texas are talking about how to look at transfer again. And of course, assessment. How, remember, they started to talk about, this all started because we were trying to find a test, right? So now, what's good practice in assessing these essential learning outcomes? Oh, there's value rubrics. Yay! We can look at value rubrics. We can use real student work. This is what we should be talking about. And even those politicians in the coordinating board had to listen to those good ideas too, because obviously the resources were there and the best practices were there. And since we were all doing this all at the same time, and we're all asking similar questions, and everybody's trying to make it happen by the fall of 2014, and everybody has to get their student learning systems going and their student information systems ready to go, everything had to happen at one time. And because of that, it was a little bit easier to all come together and say, we really want to keep elevating these good ideas about essential learning outcomes and the value rubrics and assessing real student work, and maybe we should think about trying to be a LEAP state. And that's sort of how we became a LEAP state. We all had the same questions at the same time, and we all had the same problems at the same time, and we all had the same external pressures at the same time. And so now we have 3 foci that we use, and I will read these because I know that some of the folks over there can't see it. Leveraging the newly redesigned Texas core curriculum for higher education, informed by the LEAP essential learning outcomes for the overall improvement of undergraduate education. creating a capacity for large-scale interinstitutional collaboration and robust authentic assessment, and embedding high-impact practices in the undergraduate curriculum. And you know what? Those things are an easy sell. They're a really easy sell. Everybody could agree to those things. And that's why there are so many colleges and universities that signed up to join LEAP Texas. And our commitments made sense. We wanted to continue to uphold the commitment of faculty across our various institutions. I'm checking my time so that I give Jose enough time. And adhering to the required Texas core curriculum and thinking about transferability, thinking about increasing the diverse student body and how to elevate work and citizenship and align with the state employers' goals, and responding to increasing national focus on student learning outcomes and applying the scholarship of teaching and learning. Again, these were things that institutions could buy into, and so these were the things that we had elevate us. And so now, everything in Texas is perfect. Thank you. But it's not really. We feel like we've done some things pretty well, always maintained a focus on faculty, and elevating faculty judgment and student learning and assessment, and focusing on our growing and diverse student body. We know we want to continue this. Actually, we know we want to continue this. We want to think a lot about GEMS and how GEMS is going to look in the state of Texas. And we want to keep our focus on authentic assessment and the value rubrics. And we have been thinking a long time now about how we might want to think about interinstitutional assessment. We want to figure out ways to elevate that some more. We are still working, though, on some things. For example, faculty have really good questions about best practices. And these questions should be answered, and we need to work on that. And even if it takes a while, we need to keep thinking about how we can elevate those questions and how we can get better answers. And how can we promote common student experiences and proficiencies with these essential learning outcomes? And how can we support inclusive excellence? How can we continue to elevate that? And how can we best ask students to demonstrate their outcomes through their good work? How do we really ask students well what it is that we expect from them so that they have an opportunity to demonstrate to us what they have learned in a real and authentic way, not simply with a high-stakes standardized test? And so we have some things we want to keep working on, and we're still motivated, and we want to keep our momentum going. But I've learned some really important lessons about change. Leverage external pressure whenever you can in the most positive way possible. Sometimes some of what the state wants us to do isn't always pretty or welcomed, but some things we can do, and we should keep trying. Also, carefully frame issues and solutions. If we're all in the same boat and we all have the same problem, then context and relevance should be really important in the words that we use when we're trying to come together to solve some of our problems. And so framing issues and solutions carefully can really work. There are fabulous resources out there. Elevate them, share them, don't stop. Keep going, keep sharing, keep providing opportunities. There's a lot of resources within AAC&U. Terry talked about so many of these resources just as he was beginning this session. NILOA has so many resources, and there's other organizations out there and professional organizations out there that have resources. So continue to elevate them and help faculty work through them. An important lesson I learned is communicate, communicate, communicate. Communicate up, communicate down, communicate across, communicate within the institution, communicate beyond the institution, communicate with pretty much anybody you can get to listen. Talk to them, write smart emails, write them short, use bullets, communicate, communicate, communicate. And finally, persist, persist, persist. Just keep going. Don't stop. When you know that the change is coming and you have to make it work, just keep finding ways to make it work for your institutions and for the state. And lastly, that means I'm done. And I'm on my last slide. Lastly, we're all in this together. We all have similar problems to solve, and the more that we can come to understand that this is something we all need to do, and it's not just about one group, one person, one institution, this is all of us, we can get it done. Thank you.
Good morning. So it's really a privilege for me to be here with you today to discuss the wonderful world of politics in higher ed. So we got a good front row seat view of what's going on in Texas with this topic. I'm going to basically step back a little bit and talk about higher ed and politics in higher ed more generally. But before I get started, I want to say a few words about my institution, Cal State Fullerton, where I have the privilege now for the past 2 years of serving as Provost and VP of Academic Affairs, and also as Professor of Computer Engineering. When I talk about Cal State Fullerton, I focus on 3 things: scale, diversity, and impact. Our institution serves over 38,000 students. On any given year, we're the largest campus in the largest public system of higher education in the nation. The diversity is incredible. We're a Hispanic-serving institution. We're also an Asian American and Native Pacific Islander-serving institution. 45% of our students pursuing an undergraduate degree are low-income, Pell-eligible students, and over 50% of them are first generation. In terms of impact, we award over 9,000 degrees every year. We're first in California graduating Hispanics, 6th in the nation. We are also repeatedly or frequently ranked by Washington Monthly as first in California and 4th in the nation as the best bang for the buck, so we're affordable and accessible. And we're also consistently ranked among the top 25 in the country for contributions to the public good. Notice that I did not mention U.S. News and World Report at any point. Second, I want to say a few words about the lenses and perspectives that will shape the few words I will share with you today around politics in higher ed. My comments will be from the perspective of a student. When thinking about GE in particular, a student that was not necessarily well served in his undergrad by the GE curriculum. In fact, the only thing that has saved me is that I became a faculty member and got to hang around a lot of really smart people in the humanities, the social sciences, and the arts. And I also managed to marry a cultural anthropologist who, before letting me read Friedman of A World is Flat fame, insisted that I read Stiglitz, Galeano, and Harvey. So I'm grateful to all of them. And that is also why, from the perspective of a parent, I'm terrified. I have 2 kids in college, one coming as a rising senior. And as they struggle about schools and majors, I think in the back of my mind about their GE. And that is something that we talk about frequently. As a faculty and administrator, I have had the chance over the past 25 years to experience many reform efforts. Most of them start off with a lot of energy and have very slow, painful deaths because of the lack of intentionality and attention. In fact, it was interesting. Last summer, Cal State Fullerton hosted an AAC&U integrative learning symposium, and there was a team. We had a team, obviously, from Cal State Fullerton. Some of them are here with us today. There was a team from my former institution, some folks that I had sat in committees with, trying to think about GE 20, 25 years ago. And they were still optimistic, and they were at the workshop thinking about how to garner some support for GE reform in my old institution. And finally, the perspectives are those of an advocate for my 3 years at the Education Trust in Washington, D.C. I had an opportunity to see how institutions that are serving their communities well and serving their students well manage to drive change. And what I learned from them is that it's often less about best practices, because we're all doing them, but more about better practitioners, again, about that focus and intentionality and quality of execution. So finally, since I only have about 15 minutes, let me tell you the 3 things that I'm going to be focusing on. One is the nature of change in higher ed. The second is how to gain support for change in higher ed. And lastly, how do you introduce change in higher ed? So the nature of change. So I don't know about you, but it's becoming increasingly difficult for me to ignore the disruptive nature of calls for disruptive innovation and the urgent request for the implementation of bold reforms. But when I get over it and try to parse what it is that policymakers and the public in general and pundits are saying to us in higher ed, I agree. I agree with the underlying concerns. Because basically what they're asking us to do is to expand access, to improve student learning, to increase completion rates, to narrow achievement gaps, to push the frontiers of knowledge, to better serve our communities, to produce graduates that are better prepared for the workforce, to produce graduates that are more civic-minded. That's all good. The problem, of course, is they wanted us to do it in a way that is affordable for students and families without as much support as the state should provide us. So most of that problem statement I can agree with. We can disagree on who should be paying for this, if it's the students and their families or the state, but the underlying call for action is one that I think resonates with everyone, because ultimately it's a call for action that is well aligned with our respective academic missions. The problem, of course, is this focus on disruption as the way to achieve these goals. When the reality is that we all know that in higher ed, change is less about disruption and more about transformation. And we know that higher ed in this country is capable of transformation. We all have stories from our own institutions and backgrounds. Cal State University Fullerton, I always say, is clearly a university that has been able to transform itself quite dramatically in a very short amount of time. The picture you're seeing there is of 240 acres of orange groves. That was 57 years ago. Today, those 240 acres of orange groves have transformed to one of the largest, most diverse public comprehensive universities in the country, with the statistics that I mentioned previously. Clearly, the faculty and the staff and the communities that have jointly worked to transform this place know how to get the job done. The thing we need to sort of realize, though, and maybe communicate better to our external stakeholders that are calling for disruption, is how, in practice, transforming a university, or any organization for that matter, public institution, differs from how they think, in theory, it should work. So when we look at the way that calls for disruption occur, basically, the frame that is being used is as follows. One where on the horizontal axis, I'm showing the quality of execution of the reform efforts, of the so-called disruptive reforms. And on the vertical axis, I'm showing the boldness of that reform effort. How disruptive are you going to be? So in theory, our external stakeholders think that if we are timid in our reform efforts and don't execute well, that we're just going to have status quo. They sort of intuitively understand that if we are aggressive in the boldness of our reform efforts, but don't execute well, all we're going to do is have controversy without impact. And we all know that. But they sort of think, you know, yeah, you can be timid, but execute well, you will receive improved, or you will get improved outcomes. But what we want is true transformation, and the only way you can do that is if you're really bold and you execute really well. So we're going to give you 2 years to transform GE, no money, and go to it. In fact, we all know from our many years of experience in higher ed that that's not the way it works. In higher ed, if you are not bold enough and you don't execute well, yes, you'll stay status quo. But if you want change, you have to remember that in higher ed, in our academic institutions, and for good reason, there's a natural upper bound as to how bold you can be before an institution's immune system kicks in and says, hold on, hold on, there's a lot at stake here. We're an institution of knowledge, learning. Let's hold on and think this through. When I was in Washington, D.C., I would talk about this with staffers in Congress and some of my colleagues in other nonprofit organizations, and they would say, well, surely, if you're bold enough, you can get things done, right? you can surely exceed that threshold. Well, we all know that if you try to exceed that threshold and you don't execute well, it's disaster. Forget controversy, it's disaster. You're putting the values and the foundations of your institution at risk. Well, Jose, you're exaggerating. Okay, let's say that you exceed it, but you execute very well. Right? And that's when, after a few rounds of conversations and back and forth, I would get them to the point of understanding that in higher ed, transformational change is really about the sum of many well-choreographed, well-organized, well-coordinated incremental reforms. So the way you drive student success and you increase graduation rates is not by one major graduation initiative. It's about having folks in the registrar's office, in the admissions office, in the classroom, thinking through how they can do things better. We're already doing it. It's less about doing new things. It's more about doing the things we're doing better. And this is important to keep in mind when we're thinking about tackling GE, and I just thought of just pointing out the obvious, that it's kind of ironic that in order to tackle GE, the folks that are charged with tackling GE hopefully have had a very strong liberal education in their background, not just because of the content, but because they really have to deal with diversity, complexity, and change. But the reason it's so, that framework that we just discussed is so applicable to GE is that when you think about it, if we are really going to reform GE, and Lorraine showed us the way it's being done sort of at a very high level in Texas, at the state level, it's more about dealing with various interlinked areas that require some improvement, not necessarily blowing them up. It's not about blowing up your GE curriculum or the way you deliver GE. It's about recognizing that there are structural issues, confusing pathways and advising needs that need to be taken care of, that there are coherence issues, disconnected content, operational issues, course availability, scheduling, delivery of those courses, effectiveness issues, alignment of outcomes, assessment of learning, resource issues, our FTEs, enrollment, how are we going to get funding in our department, tenure track faculty density, how do you engage the faculty that are primarily teaching these courses who happen to be, because of the disinvestment from our states, mostly part-time faculty. And of course, how do we integrate high-impact practices, particularly at institutions that have large scale? And when you're talking about GE, you're talking about maybe 2,000 to 3,000 course sections per semester. So that's the framework. Let's recognize that it's a big problem, or the challenge is important, that we address it, that it's really something that's not disruptive in the nature, the way that we need to address it does not need to be disruptive, more transformational, incremental, by dividing the problem up into its many areas of potential improvement. So that's from the nature of change as it pertains to GE. How about gaining support? Well, as Lorraine said, framing is very important. We have to be clear on why is it that we want to implement change now and why we must do it. And external pressure certainly can help drive the sense of urgency. But I would say that in pursuing the gaining support piece of the work, it is very important that we always remember to tap into the institutional culture of excellence. All of our universities are built on excellence and valuing excellence. The challenge is, how do we bridge the gap that separates our concrete reality from the rhetoric of our aspirations? Because when we look, for example, and I'll just use Cal State Fullerton's case, when you look at your mission statements, in our mission statement, it talks about learning being preeminent, that we're proud about being a regional university with a global outlook, that we are proud about being the intellectual and cultural hub of Orange County, and proud of our affordability and accessibility. We have put in place a 5-year strategic plan that has a very powerful vision. Cal State Fullerton aims to become a model public comprehensive university, nationally recognized for exceptional programs that prepare a diverse student body for academic and professional success. That strategic plan has 4 goals. That's it, just 4 goals. We lead with curricular and co-curricular program quality. The second goal is on student success and narrowing achievement gaps. The third goal is recruiting and retaining high quality and diverse faculty and staff. And the fourth goal is, how do we get the money to pay for it all? Diversifying our revenue streams. And then, of course, we have our internal program review processes and accreditation reports and external pressures coming from the state, particularly around outcomes-based funding. So when you look at the challenges that we're facing with GE, it's really, even though we need to leverage the external pressure, it's really about looking inwardly, looking at our missions, as has been said before, and seeing whether or not we are where we say we want to be. The second aspect, in addition to framing around the institutional mission and values pertaining to gaining support, is the importance of making quantitative and qualitative data come alive, making it pervasive to guide the conversations. Because we need to be able to see how far we are from those aspirations that we have set for ourselves. The data needs to be relevant, contextualized, timely, and actionable. It is a lot of work, but we need to provide folks with the data around what are the general education courses that are also serving as bottlenecks to student success. What are the effects of high-impact practices on learning on particular students? Which HIPs are better when for which students? That data is hugely important for our faculty to be able to drive the work forward. So we have to, in order to be able to gain support, frame the problem from the perspective of our mission, provide the data that is needed, and be candid. We got to acknowledge that the magnitude of the challenge that we're facing must be matched by the intentionality and coherence of our actions, and it's going to be a relentless amount of intensity of work that we need to drive over several years in order to be able to bridge the gap between our current reality and our aspirations. And finally, those that are leading these change movements on your campuses would be wise to say more about the what and the why and less about the how. One of the things that I've learned that it's, being an engineer is particularly hard for me to sort of stay back and accept this, is that my role as provost is less about project management and direction, and it's more the role of a discussant. It's about making sure that the conversations that are important for the campus community are happening and that they are moving in the right direction and knowing when to step in and when to step out and making sure that the composition of those at the table changes as the conversation moves along, and then hoping that someday, somewhere along the line, those conversations will start to converge in a way that will drive the work forward. In fact, from a resource perspective, I was just thinking the other day, Cal State Fullerton, maybe the general state funded budget is around $300 million. In any typical institution, and it's the case in Cal State Fullerton, about 70% of that is in people, right? So that's $210 million. So if you can just capture 10% of all of your people's time and put that towards productive conversations around the challenges that we face and trying to find solutions for them, you've already invested $21 million right there, right? So sometimes we think too much about the dollars that we need and try to allocate dollars when really what we should be doing when we're driving change is thinking about how to allocate time, talent, and energy. So that's about gaining support. Finally, how do you introduce change? Well, carefully. You have to leverage your shared governance structures. And when I say shared governance structures, I don't mean academic senates. I mean academic senates and administrative structures. That's shared governance, okay? And it goes to the notion of you have to have your people working together towards the goals that you have set for yourself. You have to, yes, respect the rhythms of institutional routines, but you also have to find a way to up the tempo, right? The tempo can be upped because of a sense of internal urgency, or it can be upped because the state legislature or the coordinating board says you have 2 years to do this, okay? Sometimes it's better just to do it through internal sense of urgency. And just to sort of illustrate how this is playing out at Cal State Fullerton, and the warning is that this is a work in progress and that I have very little to do this. In fact, some of my colleagues here have much more to do with it than I do. Emily Bonney, our Vice Chair of the Academic Senate, Allison Wren is our Director of Undergraduate Studies and GE, and Brent Foster is one of our faculty fellows in the Office of Academic Programs working with GE Pathways. But I've been very gratified in the time that I've been at Cal State Fullerton to see that all of those ideas on what the nature of change looks like in higher ed, how you gain support, and how you introduce change effectively have been playing out and are playing out in the way that our folks at Cal State Fullerton are approaching GE reform. So first of all, there was a retreat. And at that retreat, questions were raised around whether or not general education was meeting the needs of the university and was well aligned with our mission and our strategic goals and objectives. The questions that were surfaced during that retreat then made their way to a group that worked in an AAC&U workshop that was hosted on our campus. And this is just a snapshot of how they were thinking about the issues in our university, and it was more questions than answers at that point. They had three major questions: how to engage stakeholders, how to sustain collaboration, and what should the next steps be. After the workshop, they had a better idea. They had a roadmap on how to try to structure the change process. They didn't have the answers to what needed to be done, but they knew how to have a conversation about the conversation that needed to occur. And so there, they came away with some content goals, areas that were ripe for incremental reforms, and process goals. How are we going to talk about this with our entire campus community, and a timeline? They have, since that summer workshop, refined their work. They have done significant work in the Academic Senate in the area of programmatic student learning goals and outcomes and identifying GE objectives for student learning. In fact, this Thursday, the Academic Senate will come together into what they have called the GE meeting. And at the GE meeting, they will explore these ideas about how to move the institution forward. So it's very early in the game, but I think based on what we've learned from change in higher ed in general, that they are on the right track. Now, I find it interesting, you can't see it here in this slide deck, but I found it interesting that the group that is working or leading the GE reform effort on our university as one of the ultimate metrics of success identified for them, that they identified for their efforts, was whether or not they were voted off the island. We'll know on Thursday if that's the case. So, in closing, just want to very quickly restate the three main takeaways from this 15-20-minute presentation. One is on the nature of change, that really quality of execution trumps boldness of reform. Let's do the job right, let's be intentional, thoughtful, but purposeful. That in terms of gaining support for change, all of us have to embrace the role of discussant, no matter where we sit. It's about the conversations and having the right people in the room at the right time to get the best ideas on the table. And finally, in terms of introducing change, leverage your shared governance structure. There's not going to be any new dollars, not if you're in a public state university. You have to reallocate the talent that exists in your campus towards these efforts. And finally, we've talked about the nature of change and how to get people involved and how to introduce it, but let's not lose sight of the fact regarding the imperative for change. And the imperative for change ultimately is about replenishing opportunity in America through inclusive excellence. And that's what you all do, and that's why you're here, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine and Jose. That's our charge going forward. And I know that I also want to take a quick opportunity here to thank the co-concept planners for this session, for this conference, Ashley Finley from AAC&U and Gail Evans. Please join me in thanking them. And of course, Karen Calla and all of the staff that you've been encountering over the course of this day. So. I am very much committed to this whole notion of lifelong learning and a value of a liberal education. And so I wanted to close and send you on your way with kind of a warm feeling, because it's going to be cold out there and that kind of thing. And we may or may not actually get back to D.C. tonight. But I hearkened back to something that we're all sort of familiar with, and since we're in Missouri and Kansas City, Hallmark came to my mind, Hallmark cards and things like that. And something that you are familiar with, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem on How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. And I have low thresholds here, okay? So I was inspired by this to talk about gen ed and assessment. So how do I love thee, GE and assessment? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my liberal education must reach and demonstrate. When feeling out of sight in the midst minds and attention of colleagues in our ideal ELOs and ILOs, I love thee to the level of every new and returning student's most quiet yet fervent need for meaning by sun and curriculum committee light. I love thee freely as women and men strive for right. I love thee purely as we turn from the inadequacies of distributed silos to intentional and integrated pathways based on student work embodying signature identities. I love thee with a passion put to use in my old griefs of earlier GE reforms, and with my childhood's faith and hope. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with our lost attention to what our mission is. I love thee with the brain, logic, smiles, tears, hopes of all my life and our students and society's future. And if the Faculty Senate choose, I shall but love thee better after we assess our reform. Thank you all very, very much for being here and sharing your wisdom and learning with us and with your colleagues. Please join me one more time in thanking Lorraine and Jose. And please be safe as you travel homeward. Thank you so much.